When I first moved to Los Angeles, I was chasing the dream most people in this town pursue, becoming part of Hollywood. And like others aiming for the limelight, I wasn't an aspiring actor or director. My goal was to make a name for myself as a historical consultant. I specialized in unraveling the untold stories behind some of the most iconic landmarks in the world. Little did I know that this obsession with history would lead me to an experience I'd never forget. It began with an unexpected call. I was nursing a coffee on a slow Tuesday morning when my phone buzzed. The caller ID was blocked. Usually, I'd let it go to voicemail, but something compelled me to pick up. "Hello, this is Julian Gray," I said. "Julian, my name is Nicolas Cage," the voice on the other end said. At first, I thought it was a prank. "Yes, and I'm Brad Pitt," I quipped sarcastically. "No, seriously. This is Nicolas Cage. I was referred to you by a mutual acquaintance who mentioned your expertise in historical artifacts." His tone had that peculiar mix of charisma and gravitas he was famous for, and I began to believe him. What was Nicolas Cage doing calling a relatively unknown historian? "I need your help," he continued. "There's an artifact I acquired some years ago that I've been having issues with. I'd prefer to discuss it in person. Are you available this evening?" 1,000 questions raced through my mind, but curiosity won. "Sure," I replied. The mansion of mysteries. Later that evening, I drove up to his Beverly Hills mansion, which looked exactly as one might imagine, a Gothic masterpiece perched on a hill, bathed in the glow of strategically placed lights. The door was opened by Nicolas Cage himself. Dressed in a casual linen shirt and jeans, he looked surprisingly approachable. "Thanks for coming, Julian," he said, leading me inside. The house was a museum of sorts, filled with rare artifacts and eclectic pieces. But one object stood out, a large, intricately carved wooden chest sitting in the center of the living room. "This is what I wanted to show you," Cage said, gesturing to the chest. The carvings were ancient, and the symbols resembled a mix of Celtic and early Christian motifs. "Where did you get this?" I asked, already fascinated. "I bought it at an auction about 10 years ago," he explained. "It was part of a private collection belonging to a 19th century archaeologist named Thomas Arkwright. Supposedly, this chest was recovered from a dig site in Ireland." He paused, his expression darkening. "Strange things started happening after I brought it home. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but now, I'm not so sure." Unraveling the mystery intrigued, I asked for permission to examine the chest. Cage agreed, and I spent the next several hours documenting its details. Beneath the carvings, I discovered an inscription in Old Irish. With Cage's help, I brought out my reference books and began translating. The inscription roughly read, "He who dares to open the vault invites the guardians to follow." "That's ominous," Cage muttered. "Have you opened it?" I asked, almost afraid of the answer. "Once," he admitted. "There's a diary inside, along with a few other items." I didn't touch the diary after the first night because, well, strange things happened. "What kind of things?" He hesitated. "Shadows where there shouldn't be any. Footsteps in empty rooms. Whispering voices late at night." As a skeptic, I wanted to chalk it up to overactive imagination, but something about the chest made me uneasy. The diary, despite Cage's warnings, I couldn't resist the temptation to open the chest. Inside, I found a leather-bound diary, a tarnished crucifix, and a few yellowed pages of parchment. The diary belonged to Thomas Arkwright, the archaeologist who had discovered the chest. His entries were chilling. March 13, 1870. To the villagers warned me not to disturb the crypt, but curiosity compelled me. The chest was buried under layers of rubble, surrounded by what seemed to be ritualistic markings. I have taken it back to my quarters for further study. April 1, 1870. To strange occurrences plague me. At night, I hear voices, though I am alone. My lamp flickers without cause. This chest, it is cursed. I fear I have unleashed something dreadful. The entries grew increasingly frantic until they abruptly stopped. That's when things got worse, Cage said as I shared the highlights. I started hearing the voices too. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but now I'm convinced it's connected to the chest. The Guardians determined to get to the bottom of this. I reached out to a colleague specializing in Celtic folklore. They informed me about tales of guardians who protected sacred artifacts. Disturbing such items was said to invite these entities into one's life. When I relayed this to Cage, he didn't seem surprised. "What do we do now?" he asked. I suggested returning the chest to its original location, hoping it might appease whatever forces were at work. The journey to Ireland, Cage, ever the adventurer, insisted on accompanying me. We flew to Ireland and tracked down the site of Arkwright's excavation. The locals were wary of us, offering little help when we mentioned the chest. Late one night, we made our way to the ruins of the crypt. It was raining, the wind howling through the trees. The atmosphere was oppressive, and both of us felt like we were being watched. We placed the chest back in the crypt, reciting a simple blessing my colleague had provided. As we finished, the wind abruptly stopped, and an unnatural silence fell over the area. Closure back in Los Angeles, Cage reported that the disturbances had ceased. He thanked me profusely, promising to credit me in his next film if the opportunity arose. The experience left me shaken, but also intrigued. It was a stark reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved, even for someone like Nicolas Cage. And as for me, I decided to stick to less haunted histories, at least for a while. The return a few months had passed since the chest had been returned to the crypt in Ireland. I was back in Los Angeles, resuming my work and convincing myself that the ordeal was behind me. That is, until the day I received a package at my office. It was a nondescript brown box, with no return address. The weight was familiar, but I dismissed the thought until I tore it open and found the diary. For a moment my breath caught. I had left this in the chest, sealed away with the curse. How had it found its way back to me? A sticky note was attached to the cover, scrawled in messy handwriting. "It's not over." A desperate plea. I didn't have time to dwell on the diary because, that evening, Nicolas Cage called. He sounded frantic. "Julian, it's happening again," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The voices, the shadows. I think it followed me." "Impossible," I replied, though my heart was racing. "We put everything back. We sealed it." "Maybe not everything," he said. "Julian, I need your help again. Please." Something in his tone told me this wasn't just superstition. A dark revelation. When I arrived at his mansion, Cage looked like a shadow of himself. He had dark circles under his eyes and was visibly shaken. "I thought it was over," he said, pacing the room. "But it started small, just faint whispers at night. Then objects began moving on their own. Last night, I saw something." "What did you see?" I asked, my voice low. "A figure, tall, cloaked, standing in the corner of my room. It didn't move, but I felt its eyes on me. I felt a chill run down my spine. This was no longer just folklore." Cage gestured toward a side table where the tarnished crucifix from the chest lay. I think it's connected to this, he said. I hesitated before picking it up. The metal was unnaturally cold, and holding it sent a wave of unease through me. A forgotten detail. We reviewed everything that had transpired. It was then I remembered the diary. I think there's more to this than we realized, I said, showing him the journal that had mysteriously appeared on my desk. We began poring over the remaining pages, searching for anything we might have missed. Near the end, there was a passage that chilled me to the core. The Guardians are relentless. Returning the artifact may not suffice, for once their mark is upon you, they will follow. Only through ritual and sacrifice can one hope to sever the bond. Neither of us wanted to consider what sacrifice might entail, but the word hung heavily in the air. The ritual. Desperate for answers, I reached out to my colleague in Celtic folklore again. After explaining the situation, they reluctantly shared a ritual that could potentially banish the Guardians. It has to be something that represents your essence, I explained. Something irreplaceable. Cage thought for a moment, then retrieved a small box from a cabinet. Inside was a weathered family photo. This is the only picture I have of my parents and me together, he said quietly. If this is what it takes, I'll do it. We chose a remote spot in the Mojave Desert, far from prying eyes. Under the cover of darkness, we set up the sacred space, marking it with symbols from the diary. As Cage recited the incantation, the air grew heavy. The desert wind stilled, and an unnatural chill swept through the area. Shadows began to coalesce around us, taking on vaguely human shapes. Do not stop, I urged him, my voice trembling. Cage continued, his voice unwavering despite the growing presence around us. When he placed the photo into the flames of the ritual fire, the shadows let out an unearthly wail before dissipating into the night. The aftermath. When it was over, the oppressive feeling lifted, replaced by a strange stillness. Cage looked at me, his face pale but determined. Do you think it's over? He asked. I think we did what we had to, I replied, though part of me wasn't entirely sure. In the weeks that followed, Cage reported no further disturbances. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that our actions had consequences we might never fully understand. The diary and the crucifix were locked away in a secure vault, where I hoped they would remain undisturbed. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, wondering if the Guardians are truly gone, or just waiting for their next opportunity. A silent warning. Months passed without incident, and life slowly returned to normal, or so I thought. Nicolas Cage seemed to be back to his eccentric yet charming self. He even invited me to the premiere of his latest movie, where he thanked me in front of a crowd for helping him out of a jam without elaborating further. For a while, I let myself believe it was over. The diary, the chest, the shadows, they were all behind us. But then came the letter. It was waiting on my desk one morning, handwritten on parchment with no return address. The script was delicate, yet it radiated a sense of foreboding. You meddled where you should not have. The debt remains unpaid. That was all it said. No signature, no explanation. The unease I thought I'd left behind came rushing back. A familiar visitor that evening, Nicolas Cage, showed up unannounced at my office. He looked composed, but held an undeniable air of tension. I got one too, he said, handing me a nearly identical letter. His had an additional line, the marked cannot run. What do they mean by marked? I asked, but Cage didn't answer right away. Instead, he rolled up his sleeve to reveal a faint but intricate symbol on his forearm. one I hadn't noticed before. This appeared the night we performed the ritual, he explained. I didn't think much of it at first, but now, I checked my own arms instinctively. There was nothing. Why you and not me? I don't know, he said, but it's clear that whatever we did wasn't enough. Seeking the source determined to end this once and for all, we decided to delve deeper into the origins of the chest and its curse. We started by investigating Thomas Arkwright, the archaeologist who had discovered it. Old archives revealed a disturbing history. Arkwright hadn't simply stumbled upon the chest. He had desecrated an ancient burial ground in search of forbidden relics. The chest wasn't just a container. It was a seal, a prison meant to contain entities the ancient Celts feared and revered as gods. What was worse, Arkwright's journal hinted at a ritual he had started, but never completed. The marked our research led us to a reclusive historian in Dublin, Dr. Moira Keane, who specialized in Celtic curses. When we showed her the symbol on Cage's arm, her expression turned grave. This is a mark of binding, she said. It ties the bearer to the entities imprisoned within the chest. Returning the chest and performing a severance ritual can weaken the connection, but it cannot erase the mark entirely. Once bound, the soul is theirs to claim unless what? Cage pressed. Unless you destroy the chest completely, she said, her voice low. But doing so will unleash the entities, and they will not be merciful. A risky plan faced with this grim choice, Cage and I debated our options. Destroying the chest was unthinkable. We couldn't risk unleashing something far worse upon the world, but neither could we leave things as they were, with Cage's life hanging by a thread. There has to be another way, I insisted. Dr. Keane hesitated, then mentioned a forbidden ritual passed down through generations of Celtic priests. It was called the rite of absolution, a dangerous ceremony meant to erase the mark by confronting the entities directly. The price is steep, she warned. You will be tested, and if you fail, there will be no coming back. Cage didn't flinch. Let's do it, he said. The final confrontation, we returned to Ireland once more, this time to the ruins of a monastery where the rite of absolution was said to have been performed. The setting was stark and uninviting, with the crumbling walls casting long shadows under the moonlight. Dr. Keane guided us through the preparations, drawing ancient symbols on the ground and lighting a series of torches that flickered ominously in the night. You must step into the circle alone, she told Cage. Whatever you see or hear, you must not leave the circle until the ritual is complete. What happens if I do? He asked. You don't want to know, she replied. Cage nodded, his usual bravado tempered by the weight of what lay ahead. Facing the guardians as Cage entered the circle, the air grew heavy, and an unnatural darkness began to creep in from the edges of the ruins. I watched helplessly as shadows took form around him, their features indistinct but terrifying. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, their voices overlapping in a cacophony that made my skin crawl. Cage stood his ground, clutching the crucifix tightly. At one point, he dropped to his knees, his face contorted in pain. They're showing me things, he gasped. Memories, regrets, everything I've ever feared. You must endure. Dr. Keane shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. For what felt like hours, Cage remained in the circle, battling whatever horrors the guardians threw at him. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the darkness receded, and the torches flared brightly. Cage collapsed to the ground, exhausted but alive. The mark on his arm had vanished. Closure in the days that followed. Cage seemed lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted. He thanked me profusely, though I felt I had done little compared to what he endured. The chest remained sealed in its crypt, where I hoped it would stay forever. As for Cage, he donated the crucifix to a museum and vowed never to dabble in the occult again. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder, did we truly end the curse, or did we simply buy ourselves time? Shadows of the past months had passed since Nicolas Cage underwent the rite of absolution. For a while, it seemed as though his life had returned to normal. His movies were back in production, his interviews carried the same quirky charm, and he no longer bore the haunted look that had plagued him before. I, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something was still amiss. The chest had been returned to the crypt, Cage's mark was gone, and yet the sense of unease remained, a quiet whisper in the back of my mind. Then the dreams started. The nightmare at first, they were fragmented. I'd see glimpses of the chest, the crypt, and the shadows that had haunted Cage, but soon the dreams grew more vivid. One night, I found myself standing in the monastery ruins where the ritual had taken place. The air was cold, and the torches burned with a greenish hue. From the shadows, a voice called out not in words, but in emotions. It was angry. "You meddled with what was not yours," it said, though the words were spoken inside my head. I woke up drenched in sweat, the voice still echoing in my mind. A call for help. I reached out to Cage the next day, hoping he hadn't experienced anything similar. To my relief, he seemed completely at ease. "No dreams, no voices, nothing," he said cheerfully. "Julian, you need to relax. It's over." But I wasn't convinced. Dr. Moira Keene's warnings about the chest had been clear. Even the smallest misstep could have consequences. What if the Guardians weren't done with us? A new discovery determined to find answers. I returned to the journal of Thomas Arkwright. Though we had combed through its pages before, something compelled me to read it again, this time with a sharper eye. That's when I found it, a passage we had overlooked. It spoke of the witness, a secondary mark that could pass to another if the primary bond was severed. The passage chilled me to the core. The witness shall bear the burden of remembrance, carrying the knowledge of the guardians until their debt is repaid. The burden is subtle, yet it binds as tightly as the mark itself. I didn't need a mirror to know who the witness was. Seeking Dr. Keene, I flew to Dublin the next day and met with Dr. Keene. Her face darkened when I explained my dreams and the passage from the journal. "You've become the tether," she said grimly. "The Guardians cannot act directly upon this world without a connection, and you've unknowingly taken Cage's place. Is there a way to break it?" I asked desperately. Dr. Keene hesitated. The rite of absolution was only ever meant for one. There are no records of a second ritual. However, what? I pressed. "There's an ancient text known as the Codex of Shadows," she said. "It's said to contain knowledge of the Guardians and the means to truly end their influence. But it was lost centuries ago. The hunt begins with no other options. I began the search for the Codex. Cage, ever loyal, insisted on helping. This thing almost destroyed me," he said. "If there's a chance we can stop it for good, I'm in." Our journey took us across continents, from the dusty archives of European cathedrals to the private collections of eccentric historians. Along the way, we encountered dead ends, cryptic clues, and people who warned us to abandon our quest. One clue finally led us to a remote village in Romania, where local legends spoke of a cursed book hidden in the ruins of an ancient abbey. The Codex of Shadows. The abbey was perched on a windswept cliff, its crumbling walls a testament to centuries of neglect. As we entered, the air grew colder, and a sense of foreboding settled over us. After hours of searching, we found it, the Codex of Shadows. Its pages were blackened and brittle, inscribed with silver ink that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Cage held it up, his expression a mix of awe and fear. "This is it," he said. But as soon as the book was in our hands, the shadows returned. The guardian's strike, the temperature plummeted, and the faint glow of moonlight disappeared, replaced by an unnatural darkness. The shadows moved with purpose this time, their forms solidifying into grotesque shapes. "You cannot take what is ours," a voice boomed, echoing through the abbey. Cage and I stood back, the codex clutched tightly in my arms. The guardians circled us, their movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. "What do we do?" Cage shouted. "The symbols." I yelled, recalling the protective sigils we had used during the first ritual. Using the silver ink from the codex, we hastily drew the symbols on the ground. The guardians recoiled but didn't retreat. "They're not leaving," Cage said, his voice rising in panic. "We need to finish the ritual," I said, flipping through the codex for the necessary incantation. The final stand as I read aloud from the codex. The shadows writhed and screamed, their forms dissolving into smoke. Cage joined in, his voice lending strength to the words. The ritual was grueling, and the guardians fought back with everything they had. At one point, Cage was knocked to the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But we didn't stop. Finally, with one last phrase, a blinding light filled the abbey. The shadows let out a deafening wail before disintegrating completely. When the light faded, the abbey was silent. True freedom, the Codex of Shadows lay in ashes, its power expended. Cage and I emerged from the ruins battered, but alive. For the first time in months, the oppressive weight I had carried was gone. "This time," Cage said, "it really is over." I nodded, though part of me still wondered if we had truly seen the end of the Guardians, or if they were simply waiting for their next victim. One thing was certain: the chest, the Guardians, and the curse would haunt my dreams for years to come. But for now, we had won. The quiet aftermath. For the first time in what felt like years, my life returned to a semblance of normalcy. Nicolas Cage, ever the enigmatic character, seemed to bounce back almost effortlessly. His next film was already in production, and his public appearances were as magnetic as ever. But for me, the scars of our ordeal were not so easily forgotten. The nights were still long, and though the oppressive sense of dread had lifted, faint echoes of the Guardians' voices sometimes lingered in my dreams. I told myself it was just my imagination, residual fear from what we had endured. And then I received another letter. A new warning. The letter was identical to the one I had received months ago, written in the same delicate script on aged parchment. But this time, it was far more specific. "The Codex was not yours to destroy. You severed one chain, but the vault remains. The Guardians await." It didn't take much to decipher its meaning. The chest, sealed away in its crypt, was still a ticking time bomb. We had dealt with the Guardians temporarily, but we hadn't eradicated their presence. I showed the letter to Cage, who read it in silence before crumpling it in his hand. "They won't let us go, will they?" he asked. "No," I said, "not as long as the chest exists." The last link. Dr. Moira Keane, who had been our guiding light through so much of this journey, was our first call. Her voice was weary when I explained the contents of the letter. "I warned you," she said. "The Codex of Shadows may have weakened their hold, but the Guardian's power is tied to the chest. If you want to end this for good, the chest must be destroyed." "But you said destroying it would release them," I argued. "True," she said, "but there's another way. an ancient rite that can dismantle the chest and banish the entities permanently. It's dangerous and requires great sacrifice, but it's your only chance. Preparing for the final battle, the rite was called the Ritual of Sundering, a ceremony that had only been attempted a handful of times throughout history. None of those attempts were well documented, and the outcomes were shrouded in mystery. Dr. Keene laid out the requirements. The ritual had to be performed at the site where the chest was first unearthed. A series of relics connected to the guardians were needed to complete the circle of banishment. The final phase required the blood of those who had interacted with the chest as a binding agent to seal the ritual. It was a grim recipe, but we had no choice. The relic hunt, the search for the relics, was a grueling journey in itself. Each item was tied to the myth surrounding the guardians. A dagger said to have been used in ancient sacrifices, a chalice that once held sacred offerings, and a gemstone carved with the guardian's symbols. Cage and I traveled to remote locations across the globe to retrieve them. One was hidden in a forgotten temple in India, another buried deep beneath the Scottish Highlands. Each relic carried its own challenges, from cryptic riddles to physical dangers that tested our resolve. By the time we gathered the final piece, we were both physically and emotionally drained. Returning to the source, the final destination was the burial ground in Ireland where the chest had first been discovered. The site was desolate, overgrown with moss and vines, as if nature itself was trying to hide its shame. Dr. Keene met us there, along with a small team of assistants who had been briefed on the ritual. They were quiet, their expressions grim. "Once we begin, there's no turning back," Keene reminded us. Cage gave a curt nod. "Let's end this." The ritual of sundering the relics were placed in a precise formation around the chest, each one glowing faintly as they were activated. Keene chanted in a language that seemed older than time itself, her voice steady despite the growing tension in the air. As the ritual progressed, the chest began to shake violently, and the ground beneath us trembled. Dark smoke seeped from the cracks in the wood, coalescing into shapes that were all too familiar. The Guardians had returned, the Guardians' fury this time. They weren't just shadows. They had form and substance, grotesque, towering beings with features that defied comprehension. Their voices were a cacophony of anger and despair. "You dare defy us," one roared, its eyes burning like embers. Cage stood his ground, holding the dagger tightly. "You don't scare me anymore," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. The Guardians lashed out, but the circle of relics held them at bay. Keene continued chanting, her voice growing louder as the ritual reached its climax. The sacrifice, the final step, required blood. Cage and I both stepped forward, cutting our palms and letting our blood drip onto the chest. The wood hissed and smoked as the ritual took hold. The Guardians screamed, their forms twisting and contorting as they were pulled toward the chest. The relics glowed brighter, their light consuming the darkness. Finally, with a deafening crack, the chest exploded into splinters, and the Guardians vanished in a blinding flash of light. A price paid when the light faded. The site was silent. The relics had crumbled to dust, and the chest was no more. Cage and I were alive, but we both knew we had paid a price. The physical wounds would heal, but the memories would linger forever. Dr. Keene approached us, her expression a mixture of relief and sorrow. "It's done," she said. "The Guardians are gone." But I couldn't help but wonder, had we truly ended the curse, or had we simply passed it on to another? The aftermath. Nicolas Cage went on to make more films, his eccentricity as captivating as ever. He rarely spoke of our ordeal, though I knew it weighed on him as heavily as it did on me. As for me, I returned to my quiet life, forever changed by the events I had witnessed. Sometimes, late at night, I thought I heard whispers, faint and fleeting, as if the Gordian's echoes still lingered in the corners of the world. Perhaps some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. A new chapter months turned into years, and life seemed to settle into a rhythm. Nicolas Cage continued his career, crafting roles that blended his unique charisma and the depth worn from our shared ordeal. I returned to writing, pouring my experiences into stories that danced on the edge of fiction and reality. Yet, the weight of the chest, the ritual, and the Guardians never entirely left me. The whispers that lingered in the shadows of my mind were faint but persistent. They spoke not in words but in emotions, anger, sadness, and, most chilling of all, curiosity. And then, one day, I received a visitor. An unexpected arrival. It was a rainy afternoon when the knock came. I opened the door to find a young woman standing there, drenched from the downpour. She held a leather satchel in one hand and a look of nervous determination in her eyes. "Are you Julian?" she asked. I nodded cautiously. "And you are?" "My name is Eliza," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I think you know something about the vault. The one tied to the chest." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Eliza's story. Eliza explained that her grandfather had been an archaeologist, one of the original discoverers of the chest. He had kept meticulous records of his findings but had never spoken of the chest itself, referring to it only as the relic. "He passed away recently," Eliza said, her voice trembling. "While sorting through his belongings, I found this." She opened her satchel and pulled out a weathered notebook. The cover was embossed with the same strange symbols we had seen on the chest and the Codex of Shadows. Inside were detailed notes about the vault, sketches of its construction, and references to something called the Nexus. The Nexus, according to the notebook, the Nexus was a focal point of energy, an ancient construct that predated even the Guardians. It was said to be the source of their power, the wellspring from which they drew their strength. If the Guardians are truly gone, then the Nexus should be dormant, Eliza said. "But I've seen signs that it's still active." "What kind of signs?" I asked. She hesitated, then pulled out her phone and showed me a video. The footage was grainy, but it clearly captured dark tendrils of smoke emanating from the ground in a forest. The location matched the sketches in her grandfather's notebook. "They're coming back," she said. Reluctant eyes, I didn't want to believe her. After everything Cage and I had been through, I couldn't fathom diving back into the nightmare. But the evidence was undeniable, and the stakes were too high to ignore. Reluctantly, I agreed to help Eliza. Nicolas Cage, ever the thrill-seeker, was harder to convince. "Julian, we ended this," he said when I called him. "Why risk it again?" "Because if we don't, it could start all over," I said. "This time, it might not stop with us." After a long pause, Cage sighed. "Fine, but if I get pulled into another dimension, you owe me dinner. A good one." The journey to the Nexus was hidden deep in the Black Forest of Germany, a place steeped in legends of spirits and curses. Eliza, Cage, and I made the journey together, armed with little more than the notebook and a handful of supplies. The forest was oppressive, its dense canopy blocking out most of the sunlight. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself resisted our intrusion. We finally reached a clearing where ancient stone pillars jutted from the earth like broken teeth. At the center was a circular platform inscribed with runes that glowed faintly in the dim light. "This is it," Eliza whispered. awakening the nexus the moment we stepped onto the platform. The air grew colder. A low hum filled the clearing, rising in intensity as we moved closer to the center. Eliza placed the notebook on the platform and began reciting an incantation from its pages. The runes flared to life, their light pulsating in rhythm with the hum. And then the ground beneath us began to shake. The guardians returned. From the shadows of the forest, they emerged, shapes that were both familiar and alien. The guardians were not fully formed this time, their bodies flickering like unstable holograms. But their presence was no less menacing. "You dare disturb the Nexus?" One hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "We're here to end this," I said, though my voice trembled. The guardians laughed, a sound that echoed like shattering glass. "Fools, the Nexus cannot be destroyed. It is eternal." The final ritual. Eliza's grandfather's notes contained one final incantation, a desperate gambit to sever the Nexus from our world. But the ritual required something none of us were prepared for, the life force of those who initiated it. "You mean, one of us has to stay?" Eliza said, her voice breaking. Cage stepped forward without hesitation. "I'll do it." "No," I said, "you've done enough. This is my responsibility." But Eliza shook her head. "It's my family's legacy. I'll finish this." Before either of us could stop her, she began the incantation. The sacrifice. The guardians howled in rage as the Nexus began to collapse. Eliza stood firm, her voice unwavering even as the light from the runes engulfed her. "Tell my family I did this for them," she said, her eyes meeting mine one last time. And then she was gone. The aftermath. When the light faded, the clearing was empty. The pillars had crumbled, the runes were dark, and the guardians were no more. Cage and I stood in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over us. "She was brave," he said finally. "Yes," I agreed, though the words felt hollow. We returned home, carrying with us the knowledge that the Nexus was destroyed and the guardians banished. But the cost was high, and the scars would never fully heal. Epilogue. In the years that followed, I often thought of Eliza and her sacrifice. Her bravery ensured that the guardians could never harm another soul. As for Nicolas Cage, he went on to live his life with the same eccentric charm that had always defined him. He rarely spoke of the Nexus, but I knew it had left its mark on him. And me? I continued to write, weaving our story into fiction and hoping that the truth would never need to be revealed again. But deep down, I knew that some doors, once closed, are never truly locked. Perhaps one day, they'll open again, but for now, the world is safe. It all started with an invitation, the kind that comes on embossed paper with a wax seal, more fitting for a medieval royal decree than modern correspondence. My name, Julian Mercer, was written in elegant calligraphy on the envelope. I opened it to find an invitation to an exclusive auction. The event was to take place in an undisclosed location, with attendees chauffeured from a central meeting point. The items up for bid, rare artifacts and manuscripts from private collections worldwide. The signature at the bottom of the letter caught my eye. Nicolas Cage. The auction cage had always been fascinated by the arcane. His collection of artifacts ranged from dinosaur skulls to items rumored to be cursed. When I called him to confirm, he sounded almost giddy. "Julian, my friend, you've got to come. This isn't just any auction. They've got something special." "Special how?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would be anything but straightforward. "A book," he said, his voice lowering as if he were revealing a state secret. "The Grimoire Obscura." I hesitated. "You do realize books like that are usually fake, right?" He laughed. "Usually. But what if it's not?" Against my better judgment, I agreed to join him. Arrival at the chateau. The auction was held in a remote chateau in the French countryside. As the limousine approached, I could see the towering spires silhouetted against the moonlit sky. The building seemed ancient, its stone walls weathered by centuries of wind and rain. Inside, the atmosphere was one of opulence mixed with unease. Guests in evening attire mingled, their conversations tinged with whispers about the items on display. Cage, ever the showman, made a grand entrance, his tailored suit and eccentric demeanor drawing stares. He greeted me with a bear hug and immediately led me to a glass case at the center of the room. Inside was the book, the Grimoire Obscura. The Grimoire Obscura was bound in what looked like aged leather, its cover adorned with symbols that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. I felt an inexplicable pull, as though the book were aware of my presence. "This is it," Cage whispered. "The crown jewel." Before I could respond, the auctioneer took the stage. Bidding began, and as expected, the grimoire was the final item. The price quickly soared, with Cage outbidding everyone in the room. When the gavel fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just made a terrible mistake. Unlocking the tome back in Cage's private jet, he couldn't contain his excitement. "We've got to open it," he said, producing a pair of gloves and a magnifying glass, as though he were handling a priceless artifact. The book's clasp required a key, which was included with the purchase. As Cage unlocked it, a gust of cold air swept through the cabin, extinguishing the lights for a moment. When the lights returned, the book lay open on the table, its pages filled with writing that seemed to glow faintly. The language was unrecognizable, but the illustrations were clear rituals, symbols, and depictions of beings that defied description. "This isn't just a book," Cage said, his voice trembling. "It's a doorway." The first manifestation. At first, nothing seemed amiss. We returned to Los Angeles, where Cage secured the book in a specially designed vault. But strange occurrences soon began to plague him. Lights flickered in his mansion, and shadows moved where there should have been none. One night, he called me in a panic. "Julian, it's happening. The book, it's waking up." When I arrived, I found him in his study, staring at the grimoire. The pages were flipping on their own, and the air was thick with a sense of malevolence. "We have to put it back," I said. "Back where?" he countered. "The auction house won't take it, and who knows what would happen if it fell into the wrong hands." Seeking answers, desperate for a solution, we sought out an expert in ancient texts, Dr. Amelia Vasquez. She was a linguist and historian known for her work on forbidden knowledge. When she saw the book, her face turned pale. "This shouldn't exist," she said. Dr. Vasquez explained that the Grimoire Obscura was a relic from a civilization long lost to history. It was said to contain the secrets of creation and destruction, knowledge that was meant to remain buried. "But you've already opened it," she said. "And now, it's bound to you." The ritual of binding. The only way to neutralize the book's influence was to perform a ritual of binding. It required a sacred space, specific incantations, and an unbreakable will. We chose a secluded monastery in the Swiss Alps, far from prying eyes. The monks, though initially reluctant, agreed to help after seeing the grimoire's effect on Cage. The ritual was grueling. As Dr. Vasquez chanted the incantations, the book fought back. The air grew heavy, and the temperature plummeted. Shadows coalesced into forms that seemed almost human, but not quite. "Hold the line!" Vasquez shouted at his cage, and I struggled to keep the book on the altar. The final confrontation, the shadows attacked, their touch freezing and searing at the same time. Cage, ever the performer, grabbed a torch and swung it wildly, buying us precious moments. "I didn't sign up for this," he yelled, though his grin suggested he was secretly enjoying the drama. With a final, deafening chant, Vasquez completed the ritual. The shadows dissolved, and the book slammed shut with a force that knocked us all to the ground. When we looked up, the grimoire was gone. Aftermath. Back in Los Angeles, Cage and I tried to make sense of what had happened. Dr. Vasquez assured us that the book was sealed away, its power neutralized. Cage, ever the optimist, saw the ordeal as inspiration for his next role. "You can't buy material like this," he said, already jotting down notes. As for me, I returned to my quiet life, though the memories lingered. The grimoire may have been banished, but I couldn't shake the feeling that its influence still lingered, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And so life went on, though the shadows of the past were never far behind. It was late on a Tuesday night when my phone rang. The name flashing on the screen gave me pause. Nicolas Cage. I hadn't heard from him in months, not since the bizarre incident with the Grimoire Obscura. "Julian," he began, his voice tinged with a mix of excitement and apprehension. "You won't believe what I've found." I sighed, knowing this wasn't going to end well. "What now, Nick?" "Another ancient relic. A haunted painting." His laugh was a bit too nervous. "Close. It's an artifact, an amulet, actually. And it's not just haunted. It's cursed." A meeting in Prague 2 days later. I was on a plane to Prague. Cage had insisted on meeting me there, claiming the artifact's origins were tied to an ancient Bohemian legend. We met at a small cafe near Old Town Square. Cage, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and oversized sunglasses, looked every bit the eccentric treasure hunter. He placed a small wooden box on the table. "This," he said, opening it with a dramatic flourish, "is the amulet of Drahomir." The artifact was mesmerizing. A bronze medallion encrusted with gemstones, it emitted a faint, almost imperceptible hum. The design was intricate, depicting what appeared to be a serpent coiled around a tree. "Where did you get this?" I asked, unable to tear my eyes away. "An estate sale," he replied. "The previous owner was, let's just say, unlucky." The legend, according to Cage, the amulet was linked to Drahomir, a medieval alchemist rumored to have made a pact with a dark entity. The medallion was said to grant its possessor immense knowledge and power, but at a steep cost. "Every owner of this thing has met a tragic end," Cage said, leaning closer. "Bankruptcy, insanity, even death. But I think we can break the curse." "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" He grinned. "That's where you come in." The first signs, it didn't take long for the curse to make its presence known. That night, while we reviewed Dramo's writings in Cage's rented apartment, the lights flickered, and an inexplicable chill filled the room. Cage dismissed it as a power surge, but I wasn't so sure. The next morning, we found the apartment ransacked. Nothing was stolen, but the amulet's box was on the floor, its contents untouched. "You still think this is a coincidence?" I asked. Cage rubbed his temples. "Okay, maybe it's cursed. But that just makes it more fascinating, doesn't it? Seeking the alchemist's descendant to understand the amulet's curse, we decided to track down the last known descendant of Drahomir. After days of research, we found her, Mila Vavra, a reclusive historian living in a remote village. Mila greeted us with suspicion but agreed to talk when Cage showed her the amulet. Her reaction was immediate. She recoiled, muttering prayers under her breath. "You should not have brought this here," she said. "The amulet is a vessel for an ancient evil. It cannot be destroyed, only contained." She told us of a ritual passed down through her family, one that could seal the amulet's power. But it required a specific location, the ruins of Dramir's laboratory, hidden deep in the Bohemian forest. Into the forest the journey to the ruins was harrowing. Dense trees blocked out most of the sunlight, and the deeper we ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Cage, ever the adventurer, led the way, clutching the amulet like a talisman. When we reached the ruins, the air was thick with tension. The remnants of the laboratory were little more than crumbling stone walls and a fire-blackened altar. "This is it," Mila said, setting up the ritual. The ritual, as Mila began chanting, the amulet's hum grew louder, vibrating in Cage's hand. Shadows gathered at the edges of the clearing, coalescing into indistinct shapes. "Don't stop," I shouted, as one of the shadows lunged at us. Cage, displaying a surprising amount of bravery, stood his ground, holding the amulet high. The shadows recoiled, but their movements became more aggressive. Mila's chanting reached a crescendo, and the amulet began to glow. The ground beneath the altar cracked, revealing a fissure filled with an otherworldly light. "Throw it in," Mila yelled. Cage hesitated, his fascination with the artifact momentarily overpowering his sense of self-preservation. "Nick, now," I screamed. With a reluctant nod, he tossed the amulet into the fissure. The light flared, and the shadows let out a collective wail before dissolving into nothingness. Aftermath, the fissure closed, and the forest grew still. Mila collapsed, exhausted but relieved. Back in Prague, Cage seemed uncharacteristically subdued. "You know," he said over drinks, "I think I've had enough of cursed artifacts for a while." I raised an eyebrow. "You, giving up treasure hunting?" He grinned. "Let's just say I'm taking a break. For now." As we parted ways, I couldn't help but wonder if this really was the end of Cage's adventures. Knowing him, it was only a matter of time before another artifact or curse came calling. The email came late one evening, just as I was settling into bed. The subject line was succinct yet cryptic. "We need to talk and see." I opened it to find a brief message from Nicolas Cage, urging me to meet him at an old diner in Pasadena. The tone was uncharacteristically urgent, even for Cage. Knowing him, this could only mean one thing: another one of his infamous escapades into the bazaar. The next morning, I found him seated at a booth in the corner, nursing a black coffee. He looked haggard, his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. "Julian," he began without preamble, "have you ever heard of the Glenwood Asylum?" I hadn't, and I told him as much. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's an abandoned psychiatric hospital in upstate New York, closed in the 1970s under questionable circumstances. And why do you care about it?" I asked, though I already regretted the question. Cage grinned, sliding a faded photograph across the table. It showed a room lined with dusty shelves, each one packed with old medical files and equipment. At the center of the room was a strange metal box, adorned with intricate carvings. "This," he said, tapping the photo, is what I'm after. The road to Glenwood within days. We were driving through the mist-shrouded countryside of upstate New York. Cage had managed to pull some strings to gain access to the property, though his sources wouldn't or couldn't explain why the asylum had been sealed off for decades. The building loomed ahead, its decaying facade covered in ivy. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something acrid and metallic. As we entered, the atmosphere shifted. The halls were silent, yet it felt as though we were being watched. Cage, however, was undeterred, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he led the way. We're looking for the archives, he said, consulting a hand-drawn map. The archive room was exactly as it had appeared in the photograph. Dust motes floated in the stale air, and the shelves groaned under the weight of forgotten history. At the center of the room sat the metal box, just as Cage had described. He approached it with reverence, running his fingers over the carvings. "This is it," he murmured. The box was locked, but Cage had come prepared. With a few deft movements, he picked the lock and lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of journals, photographs, and what appeared to be a small, blackened stone. "What is that?" I asked, eyeing the stone warily. "That," Cage said, "is what they were hiding. The hospital's dark secret." As we flipped through the journals, a chilling story began to emerge. The asylum had been conducting unethical experiments on its patients, attempting to harness what the doctors referred to as cognitive resonance. The black stone, they believed, was a conduit, a tool to amplify psychic abilities. But the experiments had gone horribly wrong. Patients began reporting visions of shadowy figures, voices that whispered of unspeakable horrors. One journal entry stood out: "The stone must never leave Glenwood. Its power is too great, too dangerous." Cage, of course, was unfazed. "You know what this means, right?" he said, holding up the stone. "Yeah," I replied. "It means we should put it back and leave." But Cage had other ideas. The first incident that night, we stayed in a nearby motel. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud crash. Cage was in the next room, and when I rushed over, I found him standing in the middle of the chaos. His furniture was overturned, and the stone sat on the dresser, glowing faintly. "I saw something," he said, his voice shaky. "A man. No, not a man. Something else. It was watching me. I wanted to leave immediately, but Cage was adamant about returning to the asylum." Back to Glenwood the next day, we returned to Glenwood, determined to uncover the stone's secrets. As we ventured deeper into the building, the oppressive atmosphere grew worse. Shadows seemed to shift at the edge of our vision, and faint whispers echoed through the halls. In one of the abandoned patient rooms, we found a mural painted on the wall. It depicted the stone surrounded by figures bowing before it. Above them was an inscription: "The gateway awaits." Cage, ever the thrill-seeker, took this as a sign to press on. The gateway we finally reached the basement, where a heavy metal door marked restricted barred our way. Cage, ever resourceful, managed to pry it open. Inside was a chamber unlike anything I'd ever seen. The walls were covered in carvings similar to those on the box, and at the center was an altar. Cage placed the stone on the altar, and the room began to vibrate. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, coalescing into a deafening roar. A rift opened above the altar, revealing a swirling void. From the void emerged shapes twisted, grotesque forms that defied logic. "The escape, Nick. We have to go," I shouted, grabbing his arm. But he was transfixed, his eyes locked on the rift. "This is incredible," he muttered. It took all my strength to pull him away. As we ran, the asylum seemed to come alive, the walls closing in around us. Shadows reached out, and the whispers turned into screams. We barely made it out before the building collapsed behind us, the rift consuming everything within. Aftermath. Back in Los Angeles, Cage was uncharacteristically subdued. He locked the stone away in a private vault, vowing never to speak of it again. Some doors, he said, are better left unopened. I couldn't agree more. But knowing Cage, it was only a matter of time before he found another artifact and another adventure. It all started at an exclusive auction in New Orleans. Nicolas Cage, ever the collector of rare artifacts and curiosities, had invited me to join him. "I need your expertise, Julian," he had said over the phone. "There's an item up for grabs that screams once in a lifetime." The auction house, tucked away in a shadowy corner of the French Quarter, was filled with wealthy eccentrics and serious collectors. Cage, wearing a tailored suit and his signature confident smirk, blended right in. When the item came up, a weathered manuscript encased in glass, the room fell silent. The auctioneer introduced it as the Whispering Manuscript, allegedly penned by a 17th-century occultist named Ambrose Leclerc. It's said to contain secrets of communicating with other dimensions, the auctioneer intoned. The room buzzed with murmurs, but Cage was unfazed. He raised his paddle and, after a fierce bidding war, walked away with his prize for a small fortune. The first whisper that evening, back at his home in Malibu, we examined the manuscript. It was old, its leather cover cracked with age, and its pages were covered in an elegant but indecipherable script. As Cage flipped through it, a strange thing happened. The room grew colder, and I swore I heard a faint whisper, just at the edge of my hearing. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice unsteady. "Hear what?" Cage replied, his eyes gleaming with curiosity. I shook my head, convincing myself it was my imagination. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Unlocking the language over the next few days, Cage threw himself into deciphering the manuscript. He enlisted the help of a linguist, Dr. Evelyn Darby, who specialized in ancient texts. "It's a blend of Latin, Old French, and something else," she said during one of our late-night sessions. Something ... unnatural. As we decoded more of the text, the whispers grew louder. They were still unintelligible, but their presence was undeniable. Cage, however, was exhilarated. "We're onto something big," he said, pacing the room like a man possessed. The summoning one night, Cage burst into my room, manuscript in hand. "I figured it out," he said, his voice filled with both excitement and dread. He had discovered that the manuscript contained a ritual summoning spell for something called the Veilkeeper, an entity described as a guardian of forbidden knowledge. "This is insane," I told him. "You can't seriously be thinking of doing this." He grinned. "Julian, when have I ever played it safe? The ritual required specific elements. Candles made from beeswax, a circle of salt, and a particular incantation. Cage insisted on performing it at midnight in his private library. As he began chanting, the whispers grew deafening. The temperature plummeted, and the candles flickered, their flames struggling against an unseen force. Suddenly, the air in the room shifted, and a figure began to materialize. It was humanoid but indistinct, as though made of smoke and shadows. "I am the Veilkeeper," it said in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The veil keeper's warning the entity did not attack us instead. It spoke. It warned that the manuscript was a key to a door that should never be opened. Mortals are not meant to see beyond the veil, it said. The knowledge you seek will destroy you. Cage, ever the risk-taker, asked, "What's on the other side of the veil?" The veil keeper's form flickered, its voice dropping to a menacing tone. "Things that will unmake you. Do not tempt fate, Nicolas Cage." The consequences after the veil keeper vanished, the manuscript burst into flames, leaving behind only ashes. Cage was both awestruck and disappointed. "Do you realize what we just experienced?" he said. "Yeah," I replied, "a near brush with something we shouldn't have messed with." But the story didn't end there. Over the next few weeks, strange occurrences plagued Cage. Objects in his house moved on their own, and he began having vivid nightmares of the Veilkeeper. He eventually contacted a spiritual medium, who performed a cleansing ritual. But even after that, he couldn't shake the feeling that the Veilkeeper's warning had been more than just words. A final reflection months later, Cage called me, his voice unusually subdued. "I think I've had enough of the occult for a while," he said. "Maybe it's time to stick to normal hobbies." I laughed. "Nick, you wouldn't know normal if it hit you in the face," he chuckled. "Maybe, but still ... I think I'll steer clear of manuscripts. For now." But knowing Nicolas Cage, it was only a matter of time before another artifact and another adventure came calling.